Liberation struggles, you see, are never won easily, and especially if those liberation struggles claim to have revolutionary purposes, and if the political directorates of those struggles really have as their goal to wrench away from the whole arena of imperialism certain countries which have long since been colonized. The point I am making is that as the hour of decision approached for the Vietnamese revolutionary movement in 1945, that the Vietnamese communists could not afford to make any mistakes, and they could not afford to let any chance opportunities pass without being able to grasp upon those opportunities. You see, the history of social struggle is really replete with those defeats of movements whose strategists did not know how to seize the moment, whose strategists had no real sense of timing, no sense of what kind of compromise or what kind of advance to make. And you must understand that Vietnam, after all, was not an island unto herself, that it was a country that was coveted by interested powers, that it was coveted by profiteering investors, and that consequently it was on the spot and being watched. There was General de Gaulle, who was now, after all, supreme over French politics in 1945. And you know that de Gaulle had said over and again that his regime would not preside over the dissolution of the French Empire, and that France would restore every sliver of her empire at the end of the war. And consequently, that in March of 1945, it was perfectly reasonable for de Gaulle to make a statement about Indochina, and to say that Indochina would be restored within the French Empire, and that the status of Vietnam would not be decided by the Vietnamese people, but what the French Constituent Assembly decided upon. And if, after all, you think about Washington, you think about another interested power. Because all during the war, American policymakers had looked toward the open door in any colonial area that had been closed by colonial powers, and consequently, from 1943 on, those policymakers began talking about a four-power trusteeship in Vietnam at the end of the war, when the Japanese had been defeated, which meant that there would be no restoration of the monopoly over Vietnam for France. And when Truman then went to the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, he did sign an agreement for a two-power occupation of Vietnam as soon as the Japanese should surrender. That the northern zone of Vietnam, north of the 16th parallel, should be occupied by the Kuomintang Chinese in order to disarm the Japanese, presumably. But you know very well that the Kuomintang Chinese will serve as a funnel, a canal for American interest in Vietnam. And that the second zone, the southern zone south of the 16th parallel, would be occupied militarily by the British, and the British would disarm the Japanese. And you know very well that the British would serve as a canal for French interests, concerned as British policymakers were by the greatness of France as a member of that Western European bloc that Great Britain was trying to form. As for the Kuomintang Chinese themselves, you know very well that their leaders were not going to be satisfied just with disarming the Japanese, and that when General Luhan went into northern Vietnam on the 9th of September of 1945 to disarm 45,000 Japanese troops north of the 16th parallel, he went in with 180,000 troops. It looks suspicious, doesn't it? And consequently, the Kuomintang quite obviously interested not in conquering Vietnam, but certainly in installing a puppet regime there, in getting rid of revolutionaries if they should try to install themselves, and putting in their place those anti-communist emigre Vietnamese who had been in China through the 1930s and came under the patronage of the Kuomintang. In particular, those old leaders of the VNQDD, of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, who had been languishing in China since the defeat of the Yen Bay uprising in 1930. All of which meant that the Vietnamese communists couldn't make any mistakes. And when they founded the Viet Minh in May of 1941, Ho Chi Minh and his comrades played it very cautiously, that there is no military encounter by Vietnamese guerrillas and Japanese or French forces until December of 1944. It is in December of 1944 that the first military guerrilla unit is founded by Vo Nguyen Giap. And Giap, after all, forms that unit which immediately attacks certain French fortifications with great success. And you can't underestimate in your thinking the importance of Vo Nguyen Giap, because you're dealing not only with a consummate militant, somebody who was a very sincere and dedicated communist, but somebody who literally burned with an anti-imperialist passion. Because you must remember that Giap's wife and child died in a French prison, that he had been so personally victimized by French colonialism. And there is someone here with a cold passion and with a kind of an emotion both about that imperialism, but also with Giap, really a genius of guerrilla war, somebody who was the architect of the People's Army and the People's War in Vietnam, and who had spent 2 years in Vietnam, that Chinese communist base in northwestern China, and there had imbibed the experience and the wisdom of Zhu Dai, the great organizer of the Chinese Red Army, and come back with all of that very rich Chinese experience. And so you get a shift in the conjuncture in March of 1945. And the Vietnamese communists, very sensitive to changes in the opportunity, because revolution is creative opportunism, that you seize your moment. And so the 9th of March of 1945, and the Japanese disarmed the French and occupied the whole country. And the circumstances were ripe for an accelerated campaign now of guerrilla warfare. There were 2 opportunities that appeared. One, of course, was that terrible famine that struck the peasantry and the workers of central and northern Vietnam on the basis of awful harvests. And consequently, perforce, that mass was radicalized, and the Viet Minh could operate among them effectively. But more than that, the disarming of the French and the occupation by the Japanese really struck a lethal blow at the legitimacy of colonialism. What claims could the French now make who couldn't even defend their position in the colony? And consequently, you have a stepped-up, accelerated offensive by the Vietnamese communists leading the Viet Minh, that patriotic front. And it is guerrilla warfare, but it is more than that. It is all kinds of mass action. It is political mobilization. It is planting Vietnamese cells in villages and in towns. It is creating little liberation fronts wherever the Viet Minh operators and agents go. It means organizing strikes, organizing boycott of taxes, refusing to collaborate with the Japanese. It is a politicizing of that mass, even as it is a moving and a maneuvering of guerrilla warfare. Well, by the beginning of June of 1945, 6 northern provinces of Vietnam had fallen under the control of the Viet Minh, involving about 1 million Vietnamese, and consequently the day was approaching. And the conjuncture changes again in August of 1945, because then the defeat of Japan is imminent. And consequently, it is necessary for the Viet Minh, and especially its communist leadership, to trigger a national insurrection. To do that before the great powers get in, before the great powers arrive in order to settle the hash of Vietnam, to decide how it will be. And consequently, on the 7th of August of 1945, the day after the bomb fell upon Hiroshima, there was called by Ho Chi Minh a national conference of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and the decision was taken for a national insurrection the moment that the Japanese should surrender. And so on the 14th of August, 4 days after the second atom bomb over Nagasaki, Japan did surrender.
And the very next day, the 15th, Ho Chi Minh convoked what was called a People's Congress, a congress convoked by the Vietnamese, certainly dominated by the communists, but certainly having collaboration by a whole variety of patriotic groups. And the insurrection was approved, and what was established was a National Liberation Committee of Vietnam. And what General Giap did was to coordinate all of his guerrilla units into what was called a People's Liberation Army. The next day, the 16th of August, the first liberation troops of the Vietnamese enter the city of Hanoi. And there is joy in the streets of Hanoi, because this is a people's war, popular in the most profound sense of the word, because it is anti-imperialist, it is for independence, it means the renovation of the nation. And the Vietnamese troops are greeted and welcomed as they enter that city of Hanoi. The next day, in the central square, in front of the municipal theater of Hanoi, there is an assembly of tens of thousands of Hanoi Vietnamese, and they listen to speeches proclaiming the coming of independence. And they see unfurling from the municipal theater not the imperial flag, which is pulled down, but a new flag, red with a gold star, and consequently the communist flag of Vietnam unfurled in the central square of Hanoi. 2 days later, the 19th of August, the entire city is occupied. All the key buildings, it has fallen to the revolution. That same day, the city of Hue fell. And the city of Hue was the capital of Imperial Vietnam. And it was there, in fact, that Bao Dai still was claiming to rule. That Bao Dai, who the Japanese had claimed was the emperor of an independent Vietnam, but who was really their puppet. And Hue fell on the 19th of August. And so great by that time was the elan for the Vietnamese in central Hanoi that Bao Dai on the 25th of August abdicated and claimed that it was all left now to the Vietnamese and the monarchy is gone. And there remains only Cochin China. There remains only the city of Saigon. And Saigon is more difficult because there has not been that rich implantation in the south by the Vietnamese that there was between 41 and 44 in the north. And besides, the Japanese had a stronger position in Saigon. And besides, there were more anti-communist nationalists established there. And the Japanese had established a puppet government, a so-called nationalist government in Saigon. And yet, what is amazing, that on that same 25th of August, on which Bao Dai abdicated, that there was established with no difficulty in Saigon what was called the Nam Bo. And the Nam Bo was the Executive Committee of South Vietnam. It was that revolutionary government centered in Saigon for Cochin China. And the sitting government, the Japanese puppets, abdicated. Some of them even joined behind the Nam Bo. And what you get is a parade, a demonstration of 1 million Saigonese on that 25th of August of 1945. In that Nam Bo, 9 men sit. 6 of them are communists. 3 represent the coalition, headed by a communist named Tran Van Zhao, and consequently it is really all 3 parts of Vietnam in the hands of the revolution. The 29th of August, Ho Chi Minh formed a government with himself as the presiding officer. And the 2nd of September is a date burned in the minds of every Vietnamese who cares about that revolution. Because it was on that 2nd of September of 45, in the city of Hanoi, that 750,000 people thronged the streets around that central square. And Ho Chi Minh spoke, and he spoke about 80 years of oppression under French colonialism. the rape of the people and the rapine of the land, but that now independence had come and a democratic republic, and it was proclaimed the 2nd of September. And the mettle of that regime, and what it was, what its moral authority was, what its intellectual strength, what its revolutionary integrity is really expounded over the following weeks and months. It is, you see, something exciting. It is a people's government, one that cared about a suffering Vietnamese people. What came was a flurry of reforms to alleviate the burden on those people. There came the abolition of those monopolies, the monopoly over salt and over opium and over alcohol, so that there were no taxes then on commodities that really were in the everyday life of the Vietnamese. And so for the peasantry, no peasant who held 5 acres or less would pay a land tax. And the regime was not rushing toward collectivism. It didn't say collectivize the land. It didn't frighten property holders who were medium and small-sized peasants. But what it did was to say that the land of all traitors, those who had openly collaborated with the Japanese, was expropriated. And the land of the French was expropriated. And all common lands were taken up. And that land was redistributed to landless peasants. And for the workers, it was the right to syndicalize, the right to have unions. It was the 8-hour day. And for all of the Vietnamese, it was the nationalization of public services that had belonged to the French, the electricity, the railroads. And what so excited Ho Chi Minh was that crash program for education, to take an illiterate people and make them read and make them write, to do what the French hadn't done in 80 years. And so secular, free, compulsory education decreed. And what the regime did was to call on its educated, to call on its young, and to say, go as teachers, teach anywhere, in the fields, at the daytime, in the nighttime, for adults, for children. And what happened was that in 1 year, more people in Vietnam learned to read and write than in 60 years previously under the French. And so important to cope with the famine, that the people were dying and no one had done anything, that there had been 2 bad harvests in 44 and 45, and then you see all of the bad luck of revolutionaries, that in the month of August of 45, the Red River had its greatest flood in all of its history, and that there was terrible drought in the highlands, and consequently the starvation was astronomical. And what Ho did was to say, let us mobilize our energies. Later in that campaign, they would be cut off from the South, cut off from the rice basket of Vietnam. We do it then ourselves, says Ho. And every sliver of land that was not utilized was taken up and given to anybody that would work it. And there were brigades of men to repair the dikes. And there were men and women who worked side by side long hours in those fields, so that by the spring of 1946, in North Vietnam, cut off from the South by the French occupation by then, that in North Vietnam there was undernourishment, but nobody starved. And you see what it means when a regime cares. It is different that Ho mobilized that energy of the people than when Maurice Thorez did it, because that was to restore a capitalist regime in France. Ho did it so the people could survive in their own society. But it doesn't go easily. And the regime was quickly, within days, squeezed within the vise of imperialism. In the north of the 16th parallel, under the order of the Potsdam Agreement, by the 9th of September, the Chinese Kuomintang sent an army of 180,000 under the warlord General Lu Han to occupy the country. That Chinese occupation was a catastrophe. the Vietnamese still remember and talk about it vividly. In its most ostensible way, the exploitation by the Chinese was to raid the food supply, that there was so little of. That big Chinese occupation force came without any of its own resources. It lived from the land, but you see, behind that is something else. Behind that, the occupation is led by warlord generals who are well practiced in pillaging the terrain that they occupy. And with them are their capitalist businessmen friends. You see what they want to do. They want to replace the French. They want really a ripple of all the riches that they can possibly find in Tonkin. And the instrument they use for that is to say that the Vietnamese piastre is not the legal tender in their occupied zone, but the Chinese dollar, which was worthless and consequently just paper, and with that paper, these warlords and their comrades among the business elements of the Kuomintang simply ripped off the real estate, the enterprises that had belonged either to the French or to the Vietnamese. It was a raid, but that was nothing. You can get that back. What worried Ho Chi Minh and what was worrisome was that this army, which was strong there, this occupying force, might want to replace the regime in Hanoi and put a puppet regime of anti-communist nationalists who would play the Kuomintang card. Oh, that's no imagination. That from that journey between Haiphong and Hanoi, when the Chinese forces landed and marched their way to Hanoi, wherever they went, they displaced the Vietnamese local governments that themselves had ousted the mandarins and the notables. And they put behind them their own puppets, coming out of that Vietnamese nationalist party that had been in rags and in remnants and in emigration in southern China. And then most of that army was stationed in and around Hanoi. And what would stop the Kuomintang simply from ousting the regime? And how could the regime of Ho Chi Minh resist? But the Chinese didn't. And they didn't for a number of reasons that are evident to us. In the first place, they were shrewd enough to know that their puppets had no support in the country at all. And so secondly, that if they displaced the government of Ho, that they would have a guerrilla war on their hands, a national resistance. And for that, they were really not prepared. But beyond that, Ho Chi Minh played a very subtle and shrewd diplomatic game, not to get the Kuomintang too upset, to give them concessions, to give them things just to keep the structure of the new regime intact. And so on the 22nd of December of 1945, in the period before, the elections were to be held for a constituent assembly on the 6th of January of 46. And the Kuomintang demanded that no matter what the results of those elections, and certainly it would be a sweeping victory for the Vietnamese, but whatever the results, that the opposition, in other words, the puppets of the Kuomintang, should get 70 as a minimum, 70 seats out of the 380. And Ho Chi Minh said, all right, why quarrel with the Chinese about that? 70 out of 380, if you're going to win that sweeping victory. Well, you see, the elections prove something. The elections were held under the noses of the Chinese army, and the Vietnamese candidates won every seat in the elections. And Ho Chi Minh, standing in Hanoi, won 98.5% of the vote under the nose of the Kuomintang army. And so the Chinese, well, at least on Confucian, decided maybe it wasn't a good place to be. And that after all, if the communists were to be replaced, let the French do it, it's their dirty work anyway. And consequently, the thing to do is to evacuate the North and leave it to the French. And the French wanted that, but do that at a price. Get something out of it. and consequently the Kuomintang negotiated with the French and signed an agreement on the 26th of February of 1946 that on the 1st of March, the Kuomintang occupation forces would withdraw, in return for which the French gave the Kuomintang many things. They gave up those very old concessions that they had held in certain Chinese cities, in the city of Tientsin, in Shanghai, in Hankou, in Canton, all of those given up. They gave up, secondly, the Yunnan Tonkin Railroad, and they gave to the Chinese the privilege of entering into the port of Haiphong tariff-free, so that Chinese Kuomintang goods could enter into that Vietnamese market. For that, the Chinese withdrew. So, the problem for the revolution, for the time being, is French. Now, Ho Chi Minh knew perfectly well, as you do, that the French would try to get back, and that they certainly were not going to give up Vietnam or Algeria or any other colony, and that the British were going to be their cat's paw, having occupied militarily on the 13th of September in the south of Vietnam. Now, what strategy to use? It was the judgment of Ho Chi Minh and the top leadership of the Vietnamese communists that if they tried to make an insurrection against a British and French occupation at once, they would be crushed. That they needed time, and they needed some subtle maneuvering. There were ultra-leftists, there were Trotskyists of very good standing and very sincere conviction, who thought that what should have been done was immediately to catalyze a revolt, immediately to go to the extremities of the revolution, to nationalize property, to attack all French positions in order to mobilize the mass. It was the judgment, and I think it's correct, of Ho Chi Minh that this would simply mean a massive force coming in to crush this revolution. And so they played this game to be as moderate as possible, both in the north and in the south. In other words, that the Nam Bo of the revolutionary government in the south should appear democratic, should appear nationalistic, should appear orderly, so that it doesn't permit great attacks upon the French, so that it doesn't permit pillaging and all kinds of looting, and consequently, so that it seems like a legitimate regime and not to threaten socialism too quickly. The idea behind that was that the British occupying force was, after all, responsive to the newly elected Labour government in Great Britain, and that perhaps the Labour government, which seemed to have a slightly more acute conscience at times than the Conservative government, that maybe they would think, if it was a democratic, nationalistic government, it had a right to be, and it would oppose the French re-entry. The ploy was a very good one, even though it failed. And it failed for two reasons. It failed in the first place because the Vietnamese communists in the south were not as well implanted as they were in the north. There is no Ho Chi Minh down there. Somebody like Zhao, for example, is an old Stalinist apparatchik with no real repute at all at the head of the Nam Bo. And besides that, there are all kinds of anti-communist nationalist elements that still are floating around in the South. The result is that the government in the South couldn't really keep order very well. There were atrocities, the kinds of atrocities that you can understand, that are associated with revolutions, many of them honest, pent-up emotions, all of those years of exploitation, attacked the French, attacked their positions. Sometimes it was provoked. Sometimes there were those who wanted to discredit the regime. But all of that meant to the British coming in that regime was not keeping order. And secondly, that the general who came in with the British forces, General Douglas Gracie, was an imperialist in the tribe, and consequently certainly wanted the French to come back into Vietnam. So that on the 21st of September, he proclaimed martial law in the southern zone of Vietnam. And that meant prohibition of meetings, a prohibition of strikes, prohibition of demonstrations. And then Gracie did the worst thing. The next day, the 22nd, he armed about 2,000 French troops who had been holed up in the barracks outside of Saigon since the Japanese took over. And these French, when they got weapons from the British, went amok. They really went cuckoo. And consequently, they beat up on Vietnamese. They killed them. They went into drunken rampages. And by the 23rd of September, they had taken over all the prisons of the city of Saigon. And they had taken over the postal station and the offices of the Sûreté. And they were putting hundreds of Vietnamese in prison until Gracie had to disarm them himself. All of which broke the thread. And the idea of orderliness turned into confrontation. And so on the 24th of September, the Nambo, the communist-led government, proclaims a crippling general strike. And some of its followers do invade the French quarters and do begin beating up on the foreigner. And the British call for the French. And the French came quickly. And so it is the 3rd of October of 1945 that Paris lands its first contingents of troops in South Vietnam, led by General Leclerc. And you must understand about Leclerc. He is a racist, he is an imperialist, he is dull-witted, and generally stupid. He is a general. And he comes in with the idea that he will repress, and quickly, this colonial incident, the view of Vietnam that was to be held for the next 18 years. And on his way to Vietnam, he had stopped off for advice in Tokyo and gotten it from General MacArthur. And General MacArthur, with his characteristic subtlety, said to Leclerc, bring in troops, more troops, and still more troops. And so it was an immediate attack by Leclerc, and within days he had cleaned up and driven out of the city of Saigon the military forces of the Vietnamese. And then he began on the 20th of October what he thought was a 15-day mop-up campaign in the southern zone. And he had artillery and he had hardware that the Vietnamese simply couldn't cope with. And General Massu, who would become so infamous in Algeria with the OAS, led that tank campaign to reduce southern Vietnam, Cochinchina, 15 days, but it lasted 4 months. Until the 26th of February, the very day that the treaty was signed by the Chinese to evacuate the north, 4 months to pacify with that overwhelming force, because the guerrilla warfare had begun, the burning of bridges, the building of barricades, the little mobile units harassing the British force, harassing the French force, and consequently, even after pacification was complete, the guerrilla warfare went on. But they had the South. The revolution was contained there. And what was left was Tonkin. What was left was north of the 16th parallel. What was left was the government of Ho Chi Minh out. Granted that it is better implanted. Granted it is popular at every turn. Granted that it has kept order. Lots of anti-imperialist propaganda, but French lives have not been touched. There has been order, discipline in the north. The regime is exemplary. But yet the Chinese are getting out on the 1st of March. And do you blame Ho Chi Minh? He says, I've got to negotiate now with the French. Better that than a war. Better that than a war. And so there is an intermediary. The only Frenchman, really, who is on the scene ever in this whole grim story who understands what that revolution is about. A man named Jean Saint-Denis. And Jean Saint-Denis had been sent by de Gaulle to Hanoi as a commissar or a commissioner of the French government to the northern regime. And Saint-Denis begins conversations with Ho Chi Minh. And that wouldn't have come to anything except for the view of Leclerc in the south. That Leclerc wanted to conquer the north, but he had been sobered by those 4 months of guerrilla war. And consequently, he thought that the French were really not ready for it, that they didn't have the proper build-up yet. And so, yes, all right, negotiations. And so Ho Chi Minh and Jean Saint-Denis talked. And finally, by the 6th of March of 1946, they have made an agreement. And that agreement is then signed by Ho, by Saint-Denis, and by Leclerc. And Saint-Denis believed that Ho Chi Minh had bargained in complete good faith. He had sent a cable to Dargentlieu, who was the High Commissioner of France in Saigon. And he had said that this is a personnage très honorable, a person who is honorable. And so the terms of the 6th of March. And France agreed that north of the 16th parallel was an independent state, with its own government, its own parliament, its own army, its own finances. Agreed in the second place, and this the great victory of Ho Chi Minh, agreed in the second place that so far as Cochinchina was concerned, the other half of Vietnam, that there would be a referendum. Now you know perfectly well that the people of the South would vote for unification. In return for that, Ho gave up things and said that his regime would be part of the French Union, whatever that meant. But more than that, what was important, he said, all right, you may station 25,000 troops north of the 16th parallel to protect French interests, those troops to be withdrawn, 5,000 each year, until by the end of 1951, they will all be out of that area. For the colon and for the military in Vietnam, for the colonial interest of France, it was a terrible betrayal by the French government. And they ranted and raved. And Dargentlieu took the lead in this. Now you must understand that he plays a part, and that it is an important part. He is the High Commissioner who is sent out to Vietnam. And he is himself a high-ranking aristocratic type, very imperialistic, but an agent of the MRP. And the MRP, the Mouvement Républicain Populaire, the party of Georges Bidault, is the party of the French colon. The party that speaks for those that own the plantations, for the Bank of Indochina, for the functionaries and the military officers who don't want to lose a good thing. And so Dargentlieu immediately says, this is betrayal, we should invade the north and conquer it. And Ho Chi Minh and Jacques, they had taken a chance on the Ho-Saint-Denis Accord. It wasn't a compromise. It was creative opportunism, as Lenin would call it. But you have to understand that that's what Lenin did over and again. You have to understand that the modalities of revolution mean that you whip up to the maximum the potential and the vision before the revolution takes its critical turn. But to save it, that very frequently you must preach to your own people a certain moderation. Didn't Lenin do that in July of 1917? Didn't he do it again with Nep? And so there is, I think, a certain guts on the part of Ho Chi Minh to have gotten that recognition if the French would really recognize. And he was attacked by ultras, as he has continued to be attacked by ultras down to now, for having compromised in that agreement. And the 7th of March, the day after it was signed, was a great meeting in Hanoi in the Central Square. And there were 150,000 hearers, and Jacques was very passionate in defending this agreement, and Ho spoke very quietly as he did, and very briefly, and he told why it was important to, at this point, make a deal that people who had said independence or death were admitting French troops on this soil, but for a limited time the regime would stand. And then you see at the end of that speech, Ho Chi Minh says something which is 10,000 times right. You know that I would rather die, he ends that, than sell out this country. And you know, over the years of the resistance movement to the war in Vietnam, I'm talking about our thing. And how many times, as I confronted in argument and debate, in meeting and so forth, the attacks of the left upon Ho Chi Minh for the 46 Accords, in general by militants who at their full height reach his shoestrings. But it suffices to say that there is no understanding of what it is to save the congruous portion. And that's what Ho Chi Minh at least was trying to do. Now, the French made it impossible. And shortly after the thing was signed, Darjeeling in the South immediately begins what is the ploy, which is that Cochinchina will never hold that referendum. Well, the Americans knew that too. They will never hold those elections about unification. And consequently, what Darjeeling begins to do is to organize Cochinchina into a separate sovereign state under French suzerainty. And so it is that by the 1st of June of 1946, there is proclaimed the independent state of Cochinchina under a French puppet, a doctor who really represented the French rubber interests. And Ho Chi Minh decided he had to continue to try to live by these terms. That agreement of March the 6th had to be turned into a written treaty, and that would be hammered out in Paris. The 31st of May of 1946, Ho Chi Minh takes a plane to take him from Vietnam to France. The first time he will have returned to France since 1923. And he goes back and there are disappointments. He goes back and arrives there on the 1st of June, only to discover that the French back in Indochina have created an independent state of Cochinchina. He's then met at the plain by Saint-Denis, who says, the conference won't be held this month in June, it will be held in July, we've just had elections, Vidal is the prime minister, he's on vacation, you'll have to wait a month. No, you can't wait here in Paris, you're a Vietnamese, too dangerous. You and your group, you go to Biarritz, we send you to the beach in the southwest of France and we watch you. And so they sat for a month in Biarritz. Meantime, when they arrived there, incidentally, the president of a newly appointed state, or newly elected state, the president of a revolution, arrived in Biarritz in that godforsaken southwest of France, greeted not by even the prefect, but by the deputy mayor of the town of Biarritz. Well, there's a bit of racism in that. You see, it gets very extravagant. Ngozi Bini, whom you may know, was the great negotiator for the Liberation Front in Paris during all of those peace negotiations that went on for years, and who was somebody whom I used to see on those Thursday briefings that we had out in Verrières. And Ngozi Bini said to me, after the departure of Cabot Lodge, who was the American negotiator and who sat opposite Ngozi Bini, you've got to understand that this is an absolutely beautiful woman, doctor, brilliant woman, beautiful woman in any physical sense or definition, and soft-spoken, and extremely brilliant, and extremely acute, and sat opposite Cabot Lodge for 7 months in those weekly Thursday meetings, and then Lodge was replaced by Ellsworth Bunker. Lodge said goodbye at the last session that he attended to everyone in the Anglo camp, to everyone of the European delegations, walked by Ngozi Bini, opposite whom he had sat for 7 months, without saying a word, shaking hands, saying goodbye. That is pig. And that is racism. And most certainly it was true in the way in which the French treated this whole delegation. Well, Ho Chi Minh got back, at any rate, in July of 1946 to Paris. And the conference opened on the 6th, but not in Paris, in the town of Fontainebleau, because Fontainebleau was away from the Paris crowds, and Ho would not be able to appeal over the heads of the conference. But the real disappointment was that the delegation to the Fontainebleau conference was in no way serious, that it had no minister in it, that it had just Calonne, it had Max André, who represented the Bank of Indochina, it had General Salan, who would become the great general in 1953 in Vietnam, and one of the worst generals in Algeria in the late 1950s. And then it had a sprinkling of lesser politicians and lesser figures. It was not a serious delegation. The only one that had sensitivity to the Vietnamese there was an anthropologist, the head of the Musée de l'Homme, of the great anthropological center, a guy named Paul Rivet. And Rivet, who was an old man at the time, the man who had unraveled the Quechua language of the Indians in Peru. And Rivet went to that conference, a socialist, and resigned the first day, and sent a letter off to his friend Marius Boutet, who was then the Minister of Colonies in the Provisional Government. And in that letter of July of 46, Rivet says what is absolutely true about that conference. I am convinced that we have rigged this conference to ensure its defeat. We want to impose a bow-die solution on Vietnam and to bring the regime in the north to an end by depriving it of rice from Cochin China. And what Rivet did was really to hit it right on the head. What happened was that these negotiations dragged on until the 13th of September with no issue. And the conference broke up. The next day, the 14th of September, Ho Chi Minh refused to go back empty-handed and made what was called the modus vivendi with Marius Boutet. Boutet was the Minister of Colonies, and they worked out a very informal accord. France did not agree this time to recognize the independence of northern Vietnam, did not agree to support elections or a referendum over reunification, but there were deals worked out about tariffs, about the position of French nationalized property. In other words, the French were still dealing. That's what Ho Chi Minh wanted to show. Why he dealt with Boutet in September of 1946. In the back of Ho Chi Minh's mind is still that hope that maybe the French communists who are in the government, maybe somewhere among them are some communists. And maybe they will do something and really bring this government around. But in that, hope was certainly due. Because Tolles had given an interview about Vietnam on the 29th of May of 1946 to the Paris Saigon, which was a Colon newspaper in Saigon, in which he had said, the Communist Party doesn't intend in any way, shape, or form to be considered as the eventual liquidator of the French position in Indochina. The Communist Party of France, on the contrary, wants to see the French flag fly over every corner of the French Union. The result is that from Fontainebleau, ending in September of 1946, to the outbreak of the war between Vietnam and France on the 23rd of November of 1946 is one small step. There was, after all, a replacement of Leclerc. Leclerc was replaced as the head of the troops in Indochina by General Van Huy. Van Huy arrived in April of 1946, sent out a directive to those French battalions who already were occupying the northern part of Vietnam under the agreement with Saint-Denis. And consequently, the directive said, prepare for a war of conquest against northern Vietnam. And so it was only an incident that was needed. And the incident was the Haiphong incident. If you can call the events, the tragic events of the 23rd of November, an incident. In that modus vivendi that Ho had worked out with Marius Boutet, it had been said that in the port of Haiphong, the tariffs should be evenly divided between the French and the Vietnamese, and that both of them should decide what goods could come in and not come in. But on the 25th of October of 1946, the military commander of the French at Haiphong, a little colonialist named General Deb decided that unilaterally he would oust the Vietnamese from the customs offices and consequently take over the entire customs collection. Then on the 20th of November, a Chinese junk that was coming into the port of Haiphong was seized by a small French craft because it was carrying in materials of war that presumably were going to Hanoi. The result is that the Vietnamese militia, in other words, the Vietnamese militia, boarded this French craft, seized the three-man crew, and arrested them. The response on the 21st of November by General Deb was to invade the Vietnamese quarters of Haiphong. And fighting was very severe, barricades went up, and Hanoi insisted upon negotiations, told its own people in Haiphong to make a ceasefire, to throw down the barricades, really to make an end to this incident. And so the night of the 21st of November, a ceasefire was arranged. But the 22nd and the 23rd, Saigon and Paris both intervened. Dargenieux had gone to Paris. In his place was General Valmy, and Dargenieux wired to Valmy and said that I have talked to the Prime Minister Georges Bidon, and he has said that we must teach the Vietnamese of Hanoi a lesson, and that Haiphong is the way to do it. And so General Valmy wired to General Deb and said, teach a lesson. And so the morning of the 23rd of November, and here begins an 8-year war. At 7 in the morning, General Deb visited upon the military forces of Viet Minh in Haiphong an ultimatum that all of those forces were to disarm and to leave the city within 2 hours. A half hour later, General Deb attacked. There was no answer to the ultimatum, and the attack was full scale. The French threw in on that 23rd of November tanks. They had strafings by planes. They had bombings from ships. They had artillery and infantry. At the end of one day, in a population disarmed of women and children as well as men, 20,000 were killed and tens of thousands wounded. And an 8-year war began. And in the days that followed, Ho Chi Minh wired to the government of Leon Minh, which had momentarily replaced Bidon, and urged for talks to end the fighting. No reply to the telegram. Blum's position was that he was for decolonization, but France could not take an insult, and it had been insulted by the arrest of those French troops. And consequently, there was the beginning of a war in which the decisions, and this is the critical thing because it happened in the American part of the war too, in which the critical decisions would be made by the colonne, by the military, in which the parliament in France, just like the Congress in the United States, rubber stamped the requests for credits that were made over and again. Crises were manufactured, parliaments passed credits, and consequently those on the spot made policy. It's the Tonkin Bay Resolution from A to Z. And so the war began. And the French got more than they bargained for. We have a little time, and it's an 8-year war, and I'll summarize. And they got more than they bargained for. Because, you see, they had no idea of what gave the Vietnamese coherence, what gave them cohesion, what caused them to resist or caused them to fight. And so you get down, for example, to March of 1949, and the war has gone badly for the French. They have made no real progress in the north, and they decide on a political ploy. In March of 1949, they decide that Bao Dan is now the emperor of all of Vietnam. Now, they made that agreement on the 5th of March in the city of Cannes on the Riviera, because that's where Bao Dai was. And he never left Cannes and never left the Riviera, and I don't blame him. And that ploy, of course, didn't work, because that same spring of 1949, the French General Staff, in order to find out what in hell was going wrong in Vietnam, why they couldn't budge, why they couldn't move, sent out the Chief of Staff. And they sent out General Lavelle. And Lavelle, a reasonably intelligent guy, whose top secret special report on Vietnam should have forced the French to pull out. What General Lavelle said is, we can't win against this guerrilla war. We can't win against this guerrilla army. The only thing that will enable us to win is if we Vietnamize the war. In other words, if we get the Vietnamese to fight against the communists, if they have something to fight for. But General Lavelle said quite clearly that if we ask them to fight, they'll think they're fighting for French colonialism, and we can't build it that way. What is the solution? Money. Huh? The United States. The United States. And so the United States begins to get heavily involved. Do you know how heavily involved? Do you know that in the Senate report of February of 1966, we discovered that between 1950 and 54, before there was a single official American commitment in Vietnam, in those last 4 years of that war, the United States sent in aid, military and economic, to the French in Vietnam $2.75 billion. And all of that done within the context of the fear over Red China, over the fact that the Communist Revolution had won in China, and that the hidden hand of China was in Vietnam as it was in Korea, and it had to be stopped, and all of that route came in. And so in 1952, the United States also established MAG, M-A-A-G, the Military American Advisory Group, the beginning of the advisor system, in the first instance in the control of Iron Mike O'Daniel. Iron Mike O'Daniel, a complete reactionary, a guy with an absolute frenzy about the dangers to Catholicism in Vietnam, and who was going to write, for example, on the whole question of Vietnam in 1954, we are facing an atheistic communism. One hardly knows any other kind. We are facing atheistic communists who want to destroy every vestige of religion. We should emphasize that and make a religious war out of it. I have suggested to the French generals that are operating here that the bishops of Vietnam supply Vietnamese Catholic troops with special flags to carry bearing the sign of the cross. No corner was turned. And then, in 1980, in December, came the big plan to Vietnam. And the miracle was going to be performed. Well, that's what everybody said. You read the press at the time, the New York Times, and it talks always about the miracle of Delattre de Tassigny. Because when Delattre de Tassigny went out, a very high-ranking French military officer went out, and consequently, the idea was that he would turn it all around. This is a very arrogant guy, a very able military officer. He is going out to settle a little colonial incident. He is very hostile to the other military French out there because he says they're incompetent, nincompoops. They haven't been able to wrap this up in 15 days as he's going to do. And consequently, Delattre de Tassigny looks over the scene and he has an idea. And he is the first to get it, so at least say that he was original. The others all the way through, who repeated it over and over again, were simply repeating. He said, the thing to do, of course, is to have the Vietnamese shoulder the burden of this war, to make a big army of Vietnamese to fight against the communists. For that, however, there must be a cause, and this must be the cause of freedom. It must be the cause of the free world. And so Donato de Tassigny, who was rather impressive, began to do a certain amount of global propagandizing. He went to the Vatican and saw Pius XII. Well, you didn't have to convince Eugenio Pacelli to fight against the communists. He had hobnobbed with the Nazis in order to do it. But it suffices to say that Donato de Tassigny went to the Pope and said to him that the entire destiny of Christianity was at stake in Vietnam. Now, if that were true, it is on its last leg. Because most certainly, if what went on in Vietnam was going to resolve it, it's like these people, for example, who really abuse the hell out of me, these neo-Puritans who are picketing on Washington Street now in front of the potential sex shop, and their argument is that the real hostility is that it is close to 3 churches. Now, you would think, for example, if it were close to 3 churches, that the sex shop would have no effect. People would come out with halos and they would walk right by it. The sex shop would undermine those 3 churches and a high school to boot and so forth. Then really they're in great trouble. If that is the case, then I say to all the revolutionaries in South America, get a bunch of dirty pictures and stand outside cathedrals. Well, of course, the Pope wasn't going to get big money. What the Pope did was to send a special crusade emissary, as he called him, named Monsignor Dooley, to go off to Vietnam, who has been around lecturing in America since that episode. But it suffices to say that Donato continued his journey and went off to Washington. And went off to New York, and there talked in America, and that is important. He went on national television, and I have seen clips of that appeared in a documentary on the whole French war in Vietnam, and it's really imposing and impressive. With that very thick French accent, speaking English, he is saying, to you Americans who live, I don't know how he got a hold of these things, you who live in Connecticut and in Texas, your destiny is at stake in Vietnam. He went down then to the Senate and to the House of Representatives, addressed a joint Congress, and said that everything depended on Vietnam, got lots of money. Because what Donato de Tassigny was able to talk about was lobbying. He said lobbying, after all, requires money. And note the sentence here, because we find this over again. Lobbying was important in the war. That is, it was that juncture that the French managed to capture in the heart of North Vietnamese territory, which really cut a lot of the North Vietnamese troops off from the rice basket in the north. In other words, it controlled the route into the rice land. But it was surrounded by guerrilla troops, and consequently, the French really couldn't hang on to Hoa Binh at all. And so it was always that, if I hold on to this, I make a victory, and consequently, the money began to flow in. Oh, poor Donato de Tassigny. He got back, that journey was in the fall of 1951. He got back to Vietnam and discovered that he had incurable cancer. He lost Hoa Binh within 2 weeks after his return to Vietnam, went then to Paris and died in January 1952. And there's something very tragic about this, because when Donato de Tassigny dies, the last person he sees is General Valmy, who was in Paris at that time, and he said, and this is reported by Valmy right before he died, there is only one thing that bothers me, that I will die without understanding the Indo-Chinese and why they are resisting us. You see, that's really at the heart of the matter. At the very same time, you see, American policymakers were learning a lesson from which they never operated. They were in Korea at the time, after all. And in Korea, which is a plateau, barren, which has no real visible military targets. Within 3 months, they had bombed out everything that was conceivably a military target. And yet, in the last 2 years of the Korean War, 6 times as many bombs in tonnage were dropped as in the first year. They were dropping it on bombed-out land, just bombing it, and bombing it, and bombing it. And 1 million South Koreans lost their lives, and 500,000 got homeless. But the point was that somehow, one didn't know why these people were resisting. And you see, This is at the heart of that imperialistic dilemma. It's what Conrad shows in Heart of Darkness when Kurtz goes into the heart of Africa and wants more tusks and more tusks and more, and will never come out. Or what Herzog does in that film Aguirre about the Pizarro expedition against the Incas. And in the final analysis, Aguirre stands alone on a rack, and he will go on, even if the Indians are resisting. Why do they resist Spanish Catholic civilization? Well, you see, all of this is a certain kind of madness. I talk about Abi, and it was critical. 2 years later, Dien Bien Phu would be critical. After that, there would be other things that would be critical. Well, listen, I lived through that decade when every once in a while, about every other month, we talked about Quemoy and Matsu as the outposts of the free world. And there were threats of going to war against China over these two rocks off the China coast called Quemoy and Matsu. Well, when I went around the world, I got to Taiwan. I had to do something in Taiwan except look at the police spies. And so they wouldn't show me what I wanted to see, so I said, well, will you take me to Quemoy? Okay, there was some Filipino editor who was going off to Quemoy in some terrible little plane. It was really horrendous. And this Filipino editor was a real imbécile intégral from the word go. And so the two of us went to Quemoy on a non-shell day, because it was always that way. Quemoy shelled one day, and the mainland Chinese shelled the other day. It was a big game. And I got there to see what we almost went to war over 3 times. And it's a rock. It's a rock with a multi-million-dollar installation in it, military installation. And it had 21 Chinese generals on it who didn't do anything, and one very fat American general. And they take you down underneath the rock, and they fed me a very big lunch, and so forth, with a lot of this Chinese whiskey. And since there were these 21 generals, everyone toasted me, and I kept trying to get up. And then everything is getting very clear about Quemoy, this whole thing. So after this long, horrendous lunch, so I go up to the top of the rock, and you can see Amoy. I can see the mainland of China is right there. I'm on the rock, though, which we were defending. And we made this multi-million-dollar installation. And I was very drunk by that time. And a major, who was the lowest ranking officer on the rock, came over with this handful of balloons. And he said, now you will do psychological warfare. So, of course. What do you have in mind? And he said, well, you see, they have these big strings, and we put a case of soap and pictures of Jimo, Jong, and messages, and we float them to the mainland, and they encourage people, and they make rebels, you see. So I said, all right, give me a couple of those. And then I said, how many of these do you send over a day? He said 600. So I do, in my drunken state, I did some very quick rudimentary arithmetic. I said, well, in every one of these, every time you float them over, hits a mainlander immediately and liberates them within 2 seconds. It's going to take you 17,000 years. And he said, well, it's more or less a gesture. I said, and we were both standing there, and they blew the boat. And then I said, they float out to sea. And he said, well, it's just a gesture. And there was a clairvoyance about that. Because it really is madness. What is an outpost of the free world? What is a crisis? What is the Tonkin Bay crisis? What is to be defended at all costs? Suddenly, it all seemed impossible that capitalism and imperialism and bureaucratism and hierarchicalism and propaganda galore and all of it was just so completely mad. And I got back in that plane, and all I kept thinking was that the real struggle is to keep enough inner sovereignty in your life so that you can still see that it's all mad. And know that it's all mad. And you see poor Denata de Tassigny dying and saying, why do those Vietnamese resist? Well, he never even knew about it. Consequently, he died completely mystified within that framework. Came later, Raoul Salan came and had a plan. And Ali Nava came and had a plan. All these generals came and had plans. He finally got bottled up in Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is supposed to cut the Vietnamese off from Laos, supposed to cut Jacques' army. They got bottled up there. And they said to the Americans, you got to get us out of here. And General Ely went to the Pentagon, went to the State Department, and so forth. And they had grandiose plans in March of 1954. Don't think they didn't, the Americans. They were going to send 60 B-29 bombers from Clark Air Base in the Philippines. They were going to send 270 fighters from the 7th Fleet. They were really going to do it. They needed money, and the Congress wouldn't do it then. They wouldn't do it because they'd just been doing so much about Korea, and they just weren't going to do it. And consequently, Dien Bien Phu fell. But it suffices to say that all of that is on the record. And all of that is on the record. Even if you are an imperialist, you go and then repeat it. But you see, that's what I mean about the madness. You have to keep that congruous portion of yourself, or you're really lost. You have to get up every day and not only fight it, but to say it's crazy.